Today, we're diving into one of the most defining moments at the end of World War II, the Nuremberg Trials. This historic trial brought the top Nazi leaders to justice, revealing the full extent of their crimes to the world. But what really happened behind closed doors? Did every Nazi face punishment? Were some allowed to walk free? What happened to the bodies of those sentenced to death? And what about those who were released after serving their time? Let's uncover the fate of those who stood trial at Nuremberg. One of the greatest mistakes of my life, perhaps the greatest, was knowing that Jews were being sent to concentration camps, but believing they were only being forced to work. I didn't know they were being exterminated. And if you had known, if you had seen, for example, Auschwitz with your own eyes, what could you have done? I could have done nothing, except tell Hitler that I no longer wanted to be his minister. And maybe that would have been the end of it. This interview was recorded in 1971, 26 years after Adolf Hitler's suicide and the end of World War II. The man sitting comfortably in his living room is none other than Albert Speer, a former high-ranking Nazi official. He was one of Hitler's closest associates, perhaps even a friend. Speer was Hitler's personal architect and served as the Third Reich's Minister of Armaments from 1942 to 1945. He rose to the highest ranks of the Nazi regime, playing a key role in its war machine and administration. Yet, in this interview, he appears as a remorseful man, answering the French journalist Jean-Pierre Elkabbach's questions with striking ease. Elkabbach was born to an Algerian Jewish family in Oran, Algeria, on September 29, 1937, and passed away on October 3, 2023. After spending 20 years behind bars, Albert Speer published his memoirs, chronicling his life alongside Hitler. His book became a bestseller, launching him into a series of television interviews. He carefully crafts his image, portraying himself as the so-called good Nazi. But in reality, Speer was lying. By 1943, he already knew a genocide was taking place. So, how did this notorious war criminal, one of Adolf Hitler's most loyal ministers, manage to live out his life as a free man? In reality, Albert Speer was indeed arrested at the end of the war. Between November 1945 and October 1946, he was tried alongside about 20 other top Nazi leaders in one of the most important trials of the 20th century, the Nuremberg Trials. In Nuremberg, within the American zone of occupied Germany, the trial begins, set to judge the main leaders of the Third Reich. Nearly 7 months after Adolf Hitler's suicide in his bunker, the Allied powers bring the leaders of the Nazi regime to justice. It is 10 o'clock. In a cathedral-like silence, the defendants enter the courtroom one by one and take their seats on the bench. Hermann Göring is the first to enter, president of the Reichstag, head of the Luftwaffe, and the mastermind behind the Gestapo. He is the highest-ranking Nazi still alive. Though visibly thinner, he remains confident. Following him is Karl Donitz, admiral of the German Navy and Hitler's brief successor as president of the Reich. Rudolf Hess, once considered Hitler's heir, walks closely behind. Then, one by one, more figures of the Third Reich appear. There are well-known political leaders: Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments; Baldur von Schirach, head of the Hitler Youth; and Joachim von Ribbentrop, Minister of Foreign Affairs. But 3 of the most powerful Nazi leaders are missing: Hitler, Himmler, and Goebbels. All 3 took their own lives in the final days of the war. Now, 21 high-ranking Nazi officials stand before the International Military Trial in Nuremberg. They face charges of crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. That last charge is unprecedented in history. specifically created for this trial. It was designed to hold them accountable for the atrocities committed against entire populations. One by one, the Nazi officials take the stand.
You must plead guilty or not guilty. Bekenne mich im Sinne der Anklage nicht schuldig. Ich bekenne mich nicht schuldig. Nicht schuldig. Nein.
They all plead not guilty. Then, the American prosecutor, Robert Jackson, delivers his opening statement. For 10 months, the judges of the International Military Trial will interrogate the accused, examine their roles in the Nazi regime, and confront them with undeniable evidence of their crimes. The trial has begun, a trial unlike any the world has ever seen. In the opening months, from November 1945 to February 1946, the prosecution takes center stage. The Allies present their case. First, they unveil written evidence, signed orders, meeting reports, internal records, organizational charts. Tens of thousands of documents, seized after the fall of the Reich, are scrutinized in meticulous detail. For the very first time in history, films are used as evidence in court. On November 29th, a 1-hour documentary is shown inside the trial. Titled simply Nazi Concentration Camps, it is made up of footage taken by the Allies during the liberation of the camps. Some of the footage is unbearable, revealing the full horror of the crimes committed. The screening shocks everyone in the room. Even among the accused, some appear visibly shaken. Then, witnesses are called to the stand. Executioners and victims alike take their turn. For instance, on January 3, 1946, SS General Otto Ohlendorf, the head of the Einsatzgruppen, the SS units sent behind the Eastern Front in the Soviet Union in 1941 to systematically eliminate Jews, takes the stand. Without showing the slightest remorse, he describes the execution by firing squad of 90,000 people, primarily Jews, during the conquest of Ukraine. His testimony is chilling and cold, the opposite of the harrowing story told by Marie-Claude Vaillant-Couturier, a communist resistance fighter deported to Auschwitz. A few months later, Rudolf Haas, the commandant at Auschwitz from 1940 to 1943 and again in the summer of 1944, reveals the full extent of the extermination process that took place at Birkenau. Between March and July 1946, the Nazis take the stand to defend themselves. They try to justify themselves, to save their own skins. Most downplay their responsibility and involvement in the regime's crimes. In their pleas, they insist they were just following orders. Hermann Göring, however, takes a different approach. Arrogant and self-absorbed, he uses his time to deliver a propaganda speech. Combative, he evades responsibility, playing with words and making it difficult for the prosecution. As for Rudolf Hess, the Führer's former deputy, it's his strange behavior that stands out. He alternates between bouts of amnesia and moments of fanatical devotion, proclaiming his loyalty to the Führer. But there is one who stands out from the rest: Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments from 1942 to 1945. He is accused of enabling Hitler to prolong the war, and of using deportees in concentration camps as slaves to fuel the German war industry. Speer fully admits his responsibility, but the Nazi defendant's statements fail to convince the judges. On October 1, 1946, 10 months after the trial began, the verdict is delivered.
Defendant Hermann Wilhelm Göring, death by hanging. Joachim von Ribbentrop, death by hanging. Alfred Rosenberg, death by hanging.
12 defendants are sentenced to death. 3 others are sentenced to life imprisonment, including Rudolf Hess. 4 receive prison sentences ranging from 10 to 20 years. Albert Speer is given 20 years of incarceration. Finally, 3 of the accused are acquitted. 2 weeks later, on the October 16, 1946, the gallows stand tall in the center of the court. One by one, the condemned men of the Nuremberg Trials are led to the gymnasium of the prison. They are escorted to the scaffold. After being granted one last chance to speak, the executioner covers their heads, ties the rope, and then opens the trap. During the execution of the accused, things do not go as planned. Carried out in haste, the hangings are not always effective. Some of the condemned, like Wilhelm Keitel, do not die instantly. They suffocate and sometimes struggle for several minutes before dying. There is one who escapes execution, Hermann Göring. In a final act of defiance, the Nazi ogre managed to take his own life the night before in his cell. To escape justice and have the last word on his fate, he committed suicide by swallowing a cyanide capsule. A capsule that may have been secretly provided to him by an American guard. But once the death sentences have been carried out, what should be done with the bodies? The Allies refused to bury them, fearing that their graves might become places of worship. So, in secret, they embark on a covert mission. After being identified, the corpses are undressed and placed in anonymous coffins. Each coffin is labeled with the name of a fictitious American soldier. Thus, Hermann Göring becomes George Munger. The next day, 12 coffins leave the prison in secret and are taken to a crematorium in Munich, where they are incinerated in total secrecy. Finally, the ashes of the former leaders of the Third Reich are scattered in a river on the outskirts of the city. Their uniforms are burned, while their jewelry is confiscated to reimburse the cost of their execution. As for the 7 other Nazis sentenced to prison, the Allies also take every precaution. As a symbol, they decide to imprison them in Spandau, a true fortress built in Berlin, a city divided between the victorious powers. The massive complex, designed to house 600 prisoners, will be monitored alternately by the Americans, Soviets, British, and French. Thus, the condemned are transferred to Spandau prison in July 1947. There, everything is done to ensure these men serve their sentences cut off from the world. The prisoners are alone in their cells, even during their walks. They are not allowed to communicate with each other, nor make contact with the guards. Years pass, and gradually, the convicted Nazis from the Nuremberg Trials are released. Konstantin von Neurath is the first to be freed in 1954, just 8 years after the trial for health reasons. Next come Admiral Erich Raeder and Walther Funk for the same reasons. In 1956, it is Karl Donitz, Hitler's successor, who leaves prison after fully serving his sentence. After 10 years behind bars, he regains his freedom. And 10 years later, on October 1, 1966, at midnight, Baldur von Schirach, head of the Hitler Youth, and Albert Speer are released at the same time. While Baldur von Schirach shuns the spotlight, this is not the case for Albert Speer, who will decide to make his Nazi past his livelihood. Indeed, 3 years after his release from prison, Speer publishes his memoirs. In his book titled Inside the Third Reich, he seeks to clear his name and minimize his involvement in the crimes committed by the regime. Within months, the book becomes a bestseller, a true media star. Speer appears on television shows and in interviews for newspapers like Playboy. Relentlessly, he repeats his version of history. He claims to be responsible but not guilty, blinded above all by the power and personality of Adolf Hitler. But this myth, which makes Speer seem more acceptable, is nothing but a lie. In a private letter written in 1971, he will admit that he was aware of the fate awaiting the Jews. Albert Speer dies on September 1, 1981 in London. just as he was about to appear on a BBC panorama show. But in Berlin, inside Spandau prison, one man remains. Rudolf Hess, Hitler's former deputy, is still locked up there. Sentenced to life in prison, he is now the sole inmate of the fortress. Between 1966 and 1987, he spends more than 20 years alone between the prison walls. An existence led in extreme solitude. Despite calls for his release, he would never leave. Finally, on August 17, 1987, he was found hanged at the age of 93 on an electrical cable in a garden shed inside the prison. Thus, the last of the Nuremberg trial defendants passed away. A historic trial that marked the 20th century, not only for judging the main instigators of the Third Reich, but also for laying the foundation for international law. However, this was not the only trial held in Nuremberg. Between 1946 and 1949, 12 other trials took place in the same city. These trials judged doctors who conducted inhumane experiments, industrialists, high-ranking military officials, and judges who applied anti-Semitic laws. Not far from there, in Dachau, a former Nazi concentration camp, 122 additional trials convicted 540 defendants. Among them was Ilse Koch, the Witch of Buchenwald. Finally, during the denazification trials, over 5,000 citizens were convicted by German courts for crimes committed against Germans. Among them were the 3 acquitted defendants from the Nuremberg trials. Thus, by 1970, approximately 11,000 Nazis had been convicted by Allied and West German courts. However, some Nazis managed to escape justice. They fled, most often to South America. This was the case for Joseph Mengele, the doctor from Auschwitz, Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, and Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the Holocaust. In 1960, he was kidnapped by the Israeli Secret Services to be tried in 1961 during another historic trial. As you have seen, the Nuremberg trial was not the only trial that judged Nazi criminals. On the contrary, after World War II, hundreds, even thousands of trials were held. And this did not stop in the 1940s and 1950s. Because unlike other crimes, there is no statute of limitations for crimes against humanity. This means that even 80 years after the events, it is still possible to prosecute the criminals. In recent years, trials have still been held to judge criminals, particularly concentration camp guards. For example, Irmgard Furchner, the former secretary of the Stutthof concentration camp. Her trial took place in 2022, when she was 97 years old. By the way, here's an interesting anecdote. She refused to appear before the court. On the day of her trial, she fled from her nursing home. The German justice system had to issue an arrest warrant for her. They eventually found her, imprisoned her, and her trial was able to take place. In the end, in 2024, she was definitively found guilty of complicity in murder. In 2022, Joseph Schutz, a former guard of the Sachsenhausen concentration camp, was sentenced to 5 years in prison. At the age of 101, he became the oldest person convicted of crimes related to the Holocaust. He passed away in 2023, at the age of 102, without having the chance to serve his sentence. And in just a few months, the trial of Gregor Formanek, another former guard of the Sachsenhausen camp, will take place. At 100 years old, he will face charges for complicity in the murder of more than 3,300 prisoners. As we wrap up today's video, I want to extend my heartfelt thanks to all of you for your continued support. I'll be back shortly with another exciting video. Until next time, take care of yourselves and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a moment of our exciting content.